Typography in Illustrator. Now, there's lots of things you can do with type in Illustrator. Obviously, to start with, you want a font that you feel is going to work, that's got the kind of aesthetics that you're going for. So you always want to start with the font, but then we start to look at customization. So what else can we add to that font? What else can we do with that font? It might be subtle things, it might be quite drastic things. And then how do we use that type in a variety of ways? How do we add to that type? So rather than just starting with some letters and then leaving it there, it's what else can we add? Now, just on Instagram, there's loads and loads of inspiration, even simple things like making it feel 3D or adding some imagery around it or adding little sort of lines or flicks or serifs or banners, little repeat patterns in the background, adding little symbols around it. It might just simply be how you organise the letters on a page, or it might be a more complicated amalgamation of those things. I mean, if we look at this example, we've got borders going on, we've got these lovely lines coming off around the text. The text itself has been warped into this sort of shape, and the actual letters have got lots of interesting things going on. So the word you has got a little like white drop shadow. It's also got these little highlighted parts on it that make it feel 3D. The same with the word heart. We've got this 3D style effect, and then we've got an even bigger drop shadow behind it. And then we've got these lovely gradient sections on it that make it feel like it is chiseled, sort of physical type. And then obviously we've got this word which has been exaggerated into this heart shape, and then it's got all of this stuff going on behind it. All of that takes two sort of interesting-ish fonts and then adds value, adds interest, adds extra elements. So when you're working with type, there's an endless amount of stuff that you can do. And we're just going to run through some starting points, some places to begin. My advice would always be to have a good look at what is out there, have a good look at what you want to achieve. Really think about what is it that is inspiring you. Is it the composition on the page? Is it the letter forms themselves? Is it stuff that goes around the letter forms? Is it the texture? Is it the 3D feel? Is it the gradients on it? Is it the combination of the two different fonts? Is it little symbols, little icons? There's lots of things that you could sort of focus on and have a really nice vision in your mind for what you want to do. Obviously, sketching it out first is really important as well. So going through sort of ideating lots of different versions, thinking about if I did it that way, if I did it this way, especially if you're working with a short quote or a phrase or a sentence, which words go on which lines. Is it across 2 lines, 3 lines? Is it centre aligned? Is it left aligned? Which words are bigger? Are certain words more interesting? So like that previous example, the word boom was the most exciting part. Do you pick out a certain word and design that in a different way? Can the words be wrapped around something or in the shape of something? And there's lots and lots of stuff to think about, as well as obviously the letters themselves. So the letters themselves are really important, but then what else can we do? So doing some rough sketches, thinking about the fonts, thinking about the stuff that's going to go on the page, thinking about how those things go together, borders, banners, warping, 3D styles, certain letters that might be interesting shapes is a really nice start. And if you get something that you actually really like, you can just work directly over the top of that. So you can scan that into Illustrator and then you can start making your own custom letters. Or, as I'm going to sort of briefly show you, you can start to customize stuff that exists. So we'll jump into Illustrator. Now this is just a quick experiment for sort of like a retro style label. You can see here we've taken on lots of those things that we've sort of seen. So we've got a really bold outline, we've got this sort of line effect on the inside, we've got a drop shadow style thing, we've got this sort of like 3D style font where it almost sort of joins up with the letters, and then we've got these embellishments on the edges of the letters that just give what was quite a boring font to start with. If we look at sort of like an original example, if we go from there to something that is a little bit more visually exciting, that's got more sort of contrast, more interest to it, more personality to it, that feels more original to you as a designer. So step 1 is obviously find a font. This is just the Heinz font, which obviously is relevant to what we're making. We've got lots of different effects in here for warping things, so making text go into certain shapes. We can do it with sort of a pre-built effect, or we can do it with like a warp mesh like this. So these ones, again, you kind of want to, I find it easier if I've got multiple pieces of text to do them in separate text boxes. It gives me that control over being able to warp them in different ways and do one word at a time. So this is always my starting point with text, is just type it out, see what you can do with it. So if I start from scratch here, and then then pick my font that I want it in. Now you might even just start with typing it out in lots of different fonts. That's always a good start, is maybe just type out your piece of text in lots of different fonts, then type it out in your favourite font, and then look at what order do I want it to go in. Do I want it to be spread across multiple lines? How do I want it to look? How am I going to organise that in different ways? Am I going to have certain words bigger, certain words smaller? So you can start to do some of these really simple things straight away. Now, from here, to do any of these sort of warping effects, we're going to be looking at the envelope distort option, which is Object, Envelope Distort. Warp is the easiest one. So these are preset warp options, which you'll get in Photoshop as well. And you can choose different ones. And if you have this preview setting ticked on, it'll show you what it does. And then you can edit it in different ways and play around with it. Another option is Envelope Distort and Mesh. Now this one is where it gets a bit trickier. So you can see where this is kind of happening. The more rows and columns you have, the more complex it is. So I tend to start out really simple and just do 2 and 2. But obviously if you've got a certain thing in mind, then you can play with that. So now we've got all these different points on the mesh. So you can see we've got an anchor there, and we've got ones on the corners and the edges. So to edit those anchors, I need my direct selection tool, and then I'm going to click once to select the anchor. Now that it's selected, you can see I've got handles, which obviously curve the anchor, and I can move the anchor itself, and that will have a knock-on effect on the rest of the grid. So if I want the rest of the grid to do the same sort of thing, I just mimic what I've got going on there. And you can see the letter forms struggle a little bit with this. So again, the less sort of columns and pieces you've got, the better, because it looks pretty funky and that's quite hard to read. So thinking about whether that's the right thing for you, whether it will work, I think there's always better ways to do it, but it is an option. Your other option is Make with Top Object. So I can use an existing object, stick it over the top, drag to select both of them, Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Top Object. Now you can see that forces that lettering into that object that's on top. Again, issues there with whether that's legible, whether that's the right sort of shape. I could draw my own shape. I could be a bit more specific and say, okay, this is the shape that I want you to go into. Give us some sort of weird bean shape. And again, you can edit that shape with your direct selection tools. All those anchor points are malleable, movable, moldable. And then the same thing again, drag to select them both, Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Top Object. Something to play around with. It depends what you're trying to do. You could split your text. So obviously my label has got 2 words. So if I wanted that text to go inside of a circle, I could do Heinz as the top part of the circle, Beans as the second part of the circle. You can quite easily use something like the knife tool to slice that, and then it will give you those 2 as separate shapes, like that. And then I could cut that out, paste that back in, and I've got 2 separate pieces, and then do 1 word at a time and do the same thing, which would have a bit more sort of legibility. So those are our warps. Once you've got to a point where you're kind of happy with that, we can then start to customize the lettering a little bit more. So you can see here, I've got a really sort of hefty stroke on the letters, which adds a bit more interest. And you've got loads of settings within the stroke. So clicking the word stroke, we can change the ends of the lines and the corners to either flat or curved. I tend to prefer curved, but obviously if you want it pointy, so like it's quite nice actually that the end of that Z is quite pointy. You can work with that. You can change the profile of the line so that the line changes its thickness as it goes along. So I can go up to Object or Type right up here and create outlines, and then that will lock that as an object. So that is now no longer a piece of text. It is an object that I can edit, and I can go into my direct selection tool and I can start to edit these letter forms around. Now the envelope distort is still on there, so again I might want to go to Object, expand, and then that will lock those letters in that position, which is a little bit better. Now, to get my drop shadow effect, all I've actually done is duplicate that piece of text and put it behind it. So that's a nice and easy way to get a drop shadow effect. There are some inbuilt effects in here. So can you see FX in my properties panel? And then we get some different options. We get some of the things that you would probably recognize in Photoshop in some of those options there. We do have an effect gallery, things like that. So you can do some sort of more complex things. To actually edit this font, so if there was anything that I wasn't happy with or that I wanted to customize, I can use my direct selection tool now, and you can see it gives me the anchor points. So if I wanted to make this part of the H taller, I'm going to select both of those anchor points by holding shift, and I can stretch them up. You'll see obviously that has a knock-on effect on the other existing anchor points, so you do have to be careful at looking at your existing font, thinking about what's there already, planning out what you want to do. Now I'm actually just going to lock my background layer for a minute to make my life a bit easier. And then I can move all of those anchor points at once. So you can move more than one anchor point at a time. So if I wanted to move the entirety of that top of that H and keep that shape consistent, then I can do it that way. Same if I wanted to actually make the inside of the H taller. I can select that anchor point, hold shift, select the one there, select the one there, select the one there. Then I know at this point I'm actually moving the entirety of that part of the letter, and then I've got a slightly different letter form than I had before. So we can do things like that. To add to letters, you can see here I've got these little pointy out bits that I kind of liked from sort of a Western style font. You can grab your pen tool, you can add more anchor points. So I'm going to add 3, and then I'm going to move the middle ones. So that will mean that the 2 at the other side stop it from getting out of hand, and then I've added that pointy bit on the end. Another tool that we can use once we've done create outlines, so once we're in this point where we've got this font as anchor points editable, is you can use your pencil tool. Now, if you're on the existing font, you use the pencil tool, it will edit things for you. It is a little bit finicky, so you can see it's done it there. So originally had a corner. If I wanted to round that off, it will round that off for me. Now you can see obviously using my mouse, it's not perfect, it's gone a little bit wonky. It does take trial and error, does take a little bit of practice to get it to do exactly what you want it to do. You can use something as well called the smooth tool. So if I go over, can you see it moves my anchor points, it softens them out, it smooths them out, it reduces the amount of anchor points down, so you can see that sort of perfects what we've got going on there, and it will help with making things feel a bit more natural, a bit more smoother. So you can start to edit letters, you can start to remove things, start to take things away. It could be quite drastic, so if I go to this letter N, so there we go, so then we've almost taken away a major part of the letter and we've created this sort of funky effect. So lots of things you can do with the pencil tool. If I wanted to add parts on, so let's say I wanted to add quite a dramatic sort of tall serif to this, I could draw that with the pen tool. So I'm going to sort of envision where I want that to go. Something like that. So that kind of shape on the end, and then I can select both of those. I'm going to ungroup just to make it a little bit easier. There we go. Select both of those, and then if I go into properties, I've got my Pathfinder options here, which most people who've used Illustrator will be familiar with these. I'm going to unite those two things, and then it should make them one shape. And then again, you can go back in and you can use things like your smooth tool just to refine those little edges out and bring it all together. So there we have a much chunkier sort of end on. So we can draw lots of different things onto our fonts. We can add lots of things onto our fonts. We can do these sort of little like drop shadow effects. The line effect that I've got going on here is I've just drawn these lines in. And then I've used something called the width tool. So I'm just using my pen tool. I've got my line. Now, to give it these sort of fancy effects, these fancy edges, these fancy thicknesses, the width tool is on here, and then you drag to make it thicker, drag where you want it to get thinner again, drag where you want it to get thicker, drag where you want it to get thinner again. Again, it takes a bit of trial and error, but you can sort of play around with things like that, so you can get these quite interesting elements to your text. And then the more you add around it, the more sort of decorative elements, the more exciting that piece of text will seem on the page. Lots of other options you can play around with. You can see here I've been looking at this font. I wasn't quite happy with the spacing, it felt a bit odd, so I've gone in and I've readjusted the spacing. Obviously when the font is still editable, so at this point in time it's still a typed out font, there's still lots of things I can do to that lettering. So I've got lots of options here in my character panel. If I click these three dots, I can make the text bigger and smaller. I can change the spacing in between all of the letters. So I can spread the letters out, or I can squish them together. I can make the letters taller, so stretch them. And again, I could do that to one individual letter. I quite like actually the U and the Q there joining up, so that's quite nice, that works quite well. I can make them wider or thinner. So if I go into my letters and I place my cursor here, if I hold Alt on my keyboard, it will let me edit the spacing between individual letters. So it gives me that bit of control to edit them one at a time. And I could do things like that. There we go. So even just in the editable form, this is still quite interesting. There are other bits and bobs in here that you can sort of play around with, but those are my main ones. Sorry, touch type tool. This will let me move individual letters. It lets me grab a letter. It's still in its editable form, so I can still change the font of this whole thing. It lets me go in, move these letters, I can rotate them, I can play around with how they're organised. Now, obviously, if I wanted that to line up a bit better, I can go back to my normal tool, and I can go back into my kerning and use Alt to squish those together, and then I would probably go to the other side and use Alt to sort of separate those. And then if I wanted to start to create some interesting sort of effects, where this may be overlapped with that or join up in some way, then I can start to do that with the pencil tool. I quite like this Q drooping into here, and whether I could then, so if I do type create outlines, I could then go back in and bring that down, play around with how that would work, change that to a curved anchor point so that I get that nice curved shape in there, so that it feels as though this has sort of cut that letter out or down. So lots of things to do with the type. Obviously you just want to play around. You can see here I've started to look a bit more at different things. So I've layered up part of the shape. So I've duplicated my shape. I've obviously done create outlines, duplicated my shape, then I've chopped or erased half of it off, and then I've added a gradient back onto it, and then I've put that gradient back over the original text to give it this sort of nice effect to it. So loads of things you can do. As long as you've got a clear idea of what you want it to look like, we can extend things here like this. So obviously the original K looked like that, and then once you've done type create outlines, you can go in, like before, select all the anchor points that you think you want, and then you can physically drag that whole lot away. Obviously this is a little bit exaggerated, but you could play around with that, and then you could start to edit some of these, playing around with the thicknesses. To get it to feel a bit more natural and see what comes of it. And again, I could drag these down. Now, it's looking a bit crazy at the moment, so this is where I might then go back to my smooth tool and sort of adjust that to get it to feel a bit more natural. So you can see that sort of fixed it for me, and I could continue to do that up on this top corner where it looks a little crazy. So, endless stuff you can do. Your main tools really are things like your object, envelope distort, using type create outlines to then give yourself some more editing scope, using your direct selection tool to go into the letter itself, move things around, delete things out, play around with it, see what it does, changing those anchor points from smooth to curved, etc., deleting anchor points, using your pen tool to add anchor points, and then things like the pencil tool giving us that bit of extra control to actually just physically remove or add to a letter form. And obviously the smooth tool to sort of fix things when it goes a little bit wappy. Things like your Pathfinder options to add to letters, add different options, so selecting more than one shape and then using these options to combine them or join them or take them away from each other. It really gives you lots and lots of options. Obviously other approaches that you can take to these kind of things are actually drawing things from scratch. So physically going in, these were drawn over a sketch, so using the pencil tool or the pen tool to draw over the top of a sketch. You can see I've got a brush applied to make those feel a bit more hand-drawn, handmade, so I've used one of my brushes in here to give it that sort of effect. This one again, drawn directly over the top of a sketch, so you can just use your pen tool to go over something that's a bit harder to do by hand. This one obviously using your Pathfinder options, using your knife, your slice tool to chop up, distort existing fonts, edit them, move them around. I've added gradients on to make it feel 3D. This one, editing an existing font. So I've taken an existing font and then I've played around with the shapes of the letters, exaggerated these edges, added these little diamonds on, and thickened the sort of tall parts of the font to make it more exciting. So that's a rough introduction. My ideal start would always be think about your fonts, think about your inspiration, think about what you're aiming for, and just give it a go, play around, see all the different things that you can do in Illustrator with type, because there are hundreds and hundreds of options and the possibilities are endless. It's just about playing around. And I always suggest copy and paste, keep a track of the ones you've done, keep a track of the different changes, see what you like, go back to things, steal bits from there, add it to this one, to have a nice sort of like document of the different things that you've tried, the different directions that you've taken, things that haven't worked as well, things that have worked, rather than necessarily aiming for perfection. See what comes out of the process and just enjoy it.